Dark red ichor wept from the fatal wound as the chainsaw blade bit deep, slicing its way through its victim. With a final groan, the young yew tree toppled and fell, the scent of pine needles filling the air. Jock Earnshaw flicked the machine off, raising his visor and viewing the carnage with sad eyes. He hated cutting down trees, but sadly that was part of his jobs as groundsman and gravedigger for the small local cemetery of Springnoll, a village nestled in a valley tucked away amongst rich pasturelands that were brooded over by the dark and ominous lead hills of southern Scotland. Making his way slowly to a mini-digger crouching on the pathway, he took a moment to catch his breath and admire the view. Skylarks filled the air with their songs as they competed for territory across the rolling fields. Droning bumblebees laboured through the wildflowers that adorned the verges of the single-track road that led past the ancient stone walls bordering the cemetery. No kirk stood on this ground, yet it was hallowed just the same. Graves dating back several hundred years peppered the rich grass, kept dutifully short and trim by Jock. The hard-working bees would heave themselves over the walls like striped Lancaster bombers eager to investigate the graveyard, hoping to find some fresh flowers laid out to feast on. They skipped across the gossamer threads of spider silk festooned between the blades of grass and older gravestones, their shimmering strands glistening in the sun's rays. Sighing and stretching, Jock climbed into the digger and began to inch across the turf, pushing the remains of the tree out of the way. He checked his grid map of allocated plots in the still spacious grounds. Plot 242 had been purchased almost 10 years ago, and now, sadly, it was ready to receive its resident. This land had been the resting place for the local families of Springnoll since the 15th century, when the village first established itself from a group of individual small holdings into a community. Despite nearly 600 years of existence, it had not grown much. No new housing estates had sprung up as there was no influx of outsiders demanding social housing. The whole village was a bit of a heritage site, attracting tourists in the summer months, eager to immerse themselves in a traditional Scottish experience. The cottages were low-set and thick-walled. Some still burned peat for heating. They were set out in neat rows on either side of the main road that carried traffic through to the larger towns. Behind each house there was still a traditional acre of land, which many continued to use to grow their own vegetables and raise chickens. The owners of the cottages received grants and support to maintain their homes in the traditional way. Their payment was to have an open house policy for tourists wanting to see inside the old buildings. Most cottages had an extension at the back, inaccessible to tourists, where all the luxuries of modern-day living kept the families warm and comfortable in the cold, harsh winter months. Taking his faithful turfing spade out of the cab of the mini-digger, he carefully and expertly removed the top layer of verdant grass, setting it to one side to be relaid after the funeral. Satisfied that he had completed a neat job, he started the digger, which coughed into life, spitting out a customary blue puff of smoke, which billowed into the air. Carefully, Jock directed the mechanical arm as it clanked its way across the now exposed ground, driving its forked bucket into the black soil beneath. Jock was a master at his job. In one scrape, he had exposed an almost perfect-sized hole. He neatly deposited the spoil to one side, ready to be used as backfill. Another scrape pushed the depth another foot or so. He only needed to be 6 feet down on this new grave site. Another couple of scrapes and it would be ready for him to finish off the sides neatly in preparation for the burial tomorrow. 3 feet down, and he swung the bucket over the growing spoil pile. But this time, Jock was startled by a ragged strip of canvas dangling from the blades. Stopping the machine, he climbed out and stood, puzzled by the rotting canvas swinging in the light breeze. He couldn't fathom what it was. To his knowledge, this ground had never been disturbed. How had this got buried here? He looked again at the yew tree he had cut down. It was at least 50 years old and had been growing right on top of the plot. A niggling feeling grew in his gut. Jock didn't know why, but but he carefully stepped to the edge of the grave, and that niggle turned into a lurch. There, sticking out of the ground, surrounded by the remains of more canvas, was the unmistakable bones of a human arm. "Shit!" he swore out loud, panicking and rushing back to his cab to check once more the site plan. This was definitely the right plot. He hadn't made a mistake. This ground was supposedly untouched. Jock picked up his mobile. This wasn't right. Who was in 242?